Brand disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed by individuals on this platform, the callers plus invited guests, are their own. The information you hear does not reflect the overall views of all parties associated with this brand. We encourage everyone to research all things heard live or via archive for edification purposes. Discretion is advised.
Don't touch that dial. You're now listening to Debate Talk for You Radio.
Help keep the show on the air. If you want to help, you can send your donation through PayPal. The email is debatetalkforyou@gmail.com or through Cash App, $Sal Showtime. Thanks for your support.
Peace. What is your brother Tavon Sweno, aka the Orthodox Moor, aka the Seven Pillars Harrison, aka Brother Moore, and I am pleased to bring to you this afternoon a presentation by my good brother Gideon Yisrael on Israelites in Africa. One of the reasons I am pleased to bring this presentation to you from my good brother is the fact that a lot of times people talk about Israelites in a very monolithic way, in that Israelites in America have a very anti-African concept. And while that is true amongst certain groups of Israelites, it is also true amongst other groups of Israelites that they don't see their Israelite heritage as something separate from African culture. One more time, they don't see their Israelite heritage as something separate from African culture. So with that, I'm pleased to bring on my good brother Gideon. Shalom, Mat. Can you hear me? Shalom, Mat.
Yeah, shalom. Can you hear me, bro? Thank you.
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You and Sal and the rest of the Debate Talk for You staff, my brother BA, the brother Kabar, shalom to everybody listening as well.
Your mic is super low, brother man. Can you either turn your mic or get closer to it?
Yeah, excuse me.
There you go.
Yeah, my bad. Yeah, my bad. But like I was saying, man, shalom, bro. Appreciate your Orthodox more. Want to give all praises to the Most High in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. Want to thank the brother Sal, the rest of the Debate Talk for You staff, my brother BA, the brother Gabar, and the rest of the brothers and sisters as well, the listening audience. And like the brother Moore say, today we'll just be looking at some evidence into the history of Israel being in Africa and ending up in West Africa. And we'll be looking at some of those things tonight. All praises.
That's what's up. Before we get into that presentation, where can we find you on social media and YouTube, etc.?
You can find me on Cushite Israelite TV. Israelite TV is one word. I'm also affiliated with my brothers, the Yahweh War Machine. Shout out to my brothers over there on the tank. No
Tanks
doubt,
on the ground.
tanks on the ground. And that's pretty much it. You know, I kind of like to engage in conversations on other people's platforms, you know, as it regards to history and theological matters. And hopefully I'll be having a lot more content on Cushite Israelite TV in the upcoming days and months. Most High say the same.
Yes, sir. So if you enjoy what you're hearing from the good brother, I have his channel link down below. So please go subscribe to that. Please like, subscribe, and share this video as well. And so with that, brother man, the floor is yours. You can give your presentation uninterrupted. And when we're done, I have the link pinned in the chat. If the brother got the time and the energy, maybe we can take some questions from the chat. Some questions from myself as well. God willing, we'll see how this goes. But the floor is yours, brother man.
All praises. Appreciate that. And I'll share my screen. All right. So let's get it. All praise to the Most High in the name of Yahshua HaMashiach. Like I said, tonight we're just going to be looking at the information as it pertains to Israel being in Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and the migration that we see that comes from that. So, like I said, all praises to the Most High in the name of Yahshua HaMashiach. I do have this presentation laid out in basically the same format, but right now I'm going to be speaking directly to the people as we present this information as it pertains to the science of the Israelites in West Africa. All praises.
Because it said, here comes the judge. See? And that does not mean the judge.
So basically, just a little bit about myself. I am Gideon Yisrael. Definitely a soldier of the Most High. I don't claim to be a pastor, a preacher, not a teacher, but definitely a learner. One who tries to submerge himself in the word of the Most High. So basically, as it was given to me by the Most High, I would give it to you. So this is basically just an introduction to, who I am. And like I said, it's all definitely in the more structured and not structured, but more laid out format on the video. But we're gonna get straight into it. All praise to the Most High. God save the African king. Now, what we're going to be looking at is the science of indigenous jewelry of West Africa. And let me get this straight real fast, and we want to play this. Make sure I have it all laid out for you, brothers and sisters. So we're going
to... Born in Puerto Rico, the Eastern End, and Fajardo.
So what we have here is Dr. Ben describing his lineage.
The family were St. Christ, St. Thomas, and Fajardo, the eastern end of Puerto Rico, and a number of them were in the island of they called Vieques. They originally migrated from Yemen, the group to Spain. They were called Ladinos, and then they wind up in Puerto Rico. I was born into the Hebrew religion, and in the Virgin Islands, unfortunately, there was only one synagogue. And it
wait a minute, who was Jewish? Your father?
Both parties.
Your mother's Jewish too?
Yeah. And my father found it necessary at time to dabble in Roman Catholicism. Since in St. Christ there was no Jewish synagogue, there was one in St. Thomas, and seeing a black person who was Jewish was an oddity.
So give me 1 second, brothers and sisters. I need to change the transition, so I want to insert some information between each video instead of it going, because like I said, I want to give it to you straight how, I don't want it to be a rehearsed thing, because that's on my channel. But give me 1 second, Salaki. And that should be good, Brother Moore. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, for that, brothers and sisters. But let's get to it. And we're going to start over and listen to the Dr. Ben Joseph Yochanan speak about his lineage, the father of the conscious community. Excuse me, brothers and sisters, but we're about to get it right now.
And a number of them were in the island of they called Vieques. They originally migrated from Yemen, the group to Spain. They were called Ladinos, and then they wind up in Puerto Rico.
Now, what's interesting with what he's saying, he speaks of the Israelites as being Ladino, and when you read in the annals of South America by the conquistadors, the Jesuits, you know, the first Europeans to come into America, they speak of Ladinos already being in South America, or rather in the Caribbean. And that's that lineage that he's talking about. But we'll continue further.
I was born into the Hebrew religion, and in the Virgin Islands, unfortunately, there was only one synagogue. And it
Well, wait a minute. Who was Jewish? Your father?
both parties.
Your mother's Jewish too?
Yeah. And my father found it necessary at time to dabble in Roman Catholicism. Since in St. Christ there was no Jewish synagogue. There was one in St. Thomas, and seeing a black person who was Jewish was an oddity. And as it's still even up to today, as a matter of fact, most European Jews denied there was such thing as black Jews at that time. And
Now, brothers and sisters, it's interesting how the conscious community like to harp on their master teachers, but never do you really see them expound on their teachings or what they taught to them. But here we have, out of the master teacher's mouth, again, his lineage. But we'll continue.
not one of my teachers taught me anything about Africa, even the best of them.
Did your father teach you much about Africa and
Quite
tell you
so.
much about?
Quite so. In discussion, my father would always, because of his own knowledge and because of being in the UNA, the Garvey movement, anytime I would speak about certain things, as a matter of fact, when Daddy spoke to me about the Torah or the Old Testament, he constantly pointed out to me that which is of Africa in it. For instance, Daddy was saying, well, Moses, he was an African, he was born in Egypt. Long before, when people look at the map, and although they saw Egypt there, didn't recognize Egypt as being in Africa, my father had made that very clear to me.
So let's have this understood and explained, that Dr. Ben, out of his mouth, said that Moses was an African. So when we're hearing his so-called students say otherwise, they are actually taking the position that he fought against.
There are black Hebrews, there are brown Hebrews, there are yellow Hebrews. How is it that a bunch of Europeans called Jews dominate the word Jew to the extent of making you think that the very faith Hebrew is exclusive to them?
So once again, another master teacher, one whom I put great honors upon, Dr. Clark, actually one of my more favorite scholars of our time. And he himself, again, not what the conscious community is saying, who claim they are students of his, but what he is saying, that there are black Hebrews, yellow Hebrews, brown Hebrews, of all shades and complexions. So once again, we need to know what is their source of information, or who are their actual master teachers. This is their master teacher, and that's the hatred for the Hamite hypothesis. And what we got to understand when we're listening to their arguments, or rather their refutations against Israel being in Africa, that's exactly what they're speaking to. They're speaking with the Hamite hypothesis as their doctrine.
Indicate that Dr. Ben and his concern for the need of the black community for cultural and ideological structures and unity, which is obviously a lot of the praise where we will go, then proceeds to redefine his history and biblical history in a way which may be conducive to his political views as well as to history. He refers to Judaism as originating in Africa One has really opened it to read is that Abraham comes from Mesopotamia. He comes from the area which we today refer to as the Purple Crescent. Indeed, what we refer today as Judaism, the religion of the Jewish people, reached its full maturity not in Egypt, but many scholars after the first exile of 586 BCE back into Mesopotamia.
So you gotta excuse him because he was talking real low, but he's basically giving us the Hamite hypothesis as it accords, or rather as it in regards to the Bible, the biblical text. He's assigning the Hamite theory to all of the patriarchs in the Bible and all of the civilizations of the ancient Near East. Now, what we need to understand that the Hamitic theory is based on racial differentiation and has arranged the world races into superior and inferior levels. The first race are Teutonic Anglo-Saxons from Europe, and the last ones are Negroes from Africa, especially those found south of the Sahara Desert. It classified the African races into the Hamites and Negroes, something that's false because you cannot break something down and say Hamites and Negroes, because where we get the term Hamite from is where we also get the term Shemite and Japhetic from. There's no Negro in that equation. So Hamites and Shemites are Negroes as well. But I'll carry on. Egyptians are said to be the descendants of Mizraim, of Caucasian, non-cursed race, hence they were not part of inferior Negroes. The generations of other sons of Ham in Africa, who in Hamitic hypothesis have been considered as the source of civilization in Africa, these would be the Egyptians, the Nubians, Galas, Danakil, Tutsis, the Somalis, the Bejas of Eastern Africa, and Berbers, Tubes, Fulbe, and Gonchos of North Africa. Those societies are said to be not inferior like Negroes, who were uncivilized and looked like animals since they were eating herbs, they walked naked, they supposedly sexed with any person they met, sister or mother, and they were taken as slaves in Egypt. It's based in the notion that anything good to Negroes is from white Hamites, descendants of other sons of Ham, other than the cursed Canaan, the father of the Negroes. So we see here that the Hamitic hypothesis says that the Hamites, who are in all actuality Africans, it states that they are white people. So that, along with all of the ancient civilizations that we see, such as the Sumerian culture and kingdom and empire, the Akkadians, the Canaanites, all of these, with the Hamitic hypothesis, the Hittites have become white people, or Europeans rather. So what we're going to do now is basically what we have here is just the foundation of a methodology, how a person get their methodology, how a person comes to the conclusions that they have. It's just not from repeating what you read in a book or what you see in a footnote, because when you're reading a footnote, the footnote is from all of these disciplines involved. So that's what we must take into consideration when we're looking into things or we're searching out the matter. Let's not lean so heavily on the footnotes when we have an index, a bibliography, and a reference that tells us where they got it from. So footnotes are good, but they're not the end-all be-all, especially when it's based in what we just seen, the Hamitic hypothesis. So what we're going to do today is establish a fact that the sons of Jacob and his subsequent indigenous citizens of Jerusalem were widely dispersed throughout all Africa, and that they, the Israelites, are what we would call the sub-Saharan Negro type, a term that is actually an invalid one. Because when you're saying sub-Saharan, you're actually trying to limit a people to a geographical location. When in all actuality, the sub-Saharan African has been all over the Near East. As matter of fact, the whole world actually. But that's the point that we're going to establish, that these ancient Israelites and the Yuhadim were a black people. And these are the sources that we're going to use. And the reason why I got this up, because it shows that these are people from different nations and also from different periods of time. So for it to be some type of conspiracy between these nations and over this span of time is something that would have to be shown, something that will have to be proven, something that just can't be thought up and said out of your mouth with no type of factual evidence to back it up. So let's keep this in mind. These are all the people that speaks to what I'm saying. And the first place that we're going to look at is actually Avaris, just to get a start and show the antiquity of Israel being in Africa. Now, here we see Avaris is the Hyksos capital of Egypt, located at the modern site of Tel El Daba in the northeast region of the Nile Delta. As the main course of the Nile migrated eastward, its position at the hub of Egypt's Delta Emporia made it a major capital suitable for trade. Now, one thing I do want to say is, and this is very interesting, Tel El Daba, that means the mound of the hyenas. And without saying, too much on that, I just wanted to let that be known. So when we're looking at Avaris, it's a lot of things we see that are Semitic in nature. And here we have an illustration of a site from David Roll that's been excavated by Manfred Bitek. And here we see a layout of the tombs, and we see one tomb in particular with certain Egyptian, or not appears, but obvious Egyptian motifs and Egyptian themes, whereas we seen with the pyramid. Now this right here is a piece of a statue that was found on the site of Avaris by Manfred Bitek. And when we look at it, it's very interesting. And when I first saw it, I must say I thought it was rather interesting, to say the least, because what they will have you believe is this is the rendering that they get from that statue. Even down to the chisel point down the middle of the head, I think is a very juvenile attempt to kind of make it look though as it has a part like a European. But I can't be wrong. That's neither here nor there. But once they shot off the noses on the Sphinx and tear off the noses of the statues, you just can't put anything past the deceiver. But we all know that's definitely not true. These are the actual people, and these are the Afar people, one of the many tribes in East Africa that exhibit this type of hairstyle. You can even see it down to the texture. Even the lines in the hair correspond with the statue. So that's the actual people that we see that should have been displayed, and not the Egyptian statue, or rather this quote-unquote Indo-European rendering of that statue. That would definitely not be the case. But let's continue on. Now, what we're going to do is establish the fact that the Israelites, the Yahadim, were so-called black people, were so-called sub-Saharan. And to do this with a proper methodology, you must source out the oldest source that's stating whether it's inconsequential or not, meaning whether they directly speaks to it or it indirectly speaks to the physical character or the physiognomy of the Israelites, because that's what we must start off with to have a proper methodology. And here, me myself, I came and I found the earliest reference to the physical character of Israel within Tacitus' histories. And Tacitus was an individual from the 1st century AD. So in his descriptions, he is saying that these Israelites, among being identified among several nations, come from not only the Ethiopians, but the Egyptians, whom we know are so-called sub-Saharan. Now, as it comes to the other people that he's associated the Israelites coming from, those people as well, when you remove the Hamitic hypothesis, or rather how I say it, the hatred for the Hamite hypothesis, when you take that away from the equation, these people too are like the Ethiopians, because remember, Herodotus speaks of the Colchians being Ethiopians, or a colony rather of the Egyptians. So all of these people in the so-called ancient Near East, or ancient Near East, were so-called sub-Saharan black people, were sons of Ham, were sons of Shem. So this is a 1st century account saying that the Israelites are a Negro people. This is very important. And if somebody has an earlier reference stating that they are white and blue eyes, just stating the fact of the matter, please bring that forward. But this is where me as a researcher starts at. And then we can continue further on in the 1st century. We have Strabo. He was a Greek philosopher, historian, who also lived in the ancient Near East during the Roman times. And what he says is, and I will read this part. He says the western extremities of Judea towards Cassius are occupied by Idumeans and by the Lake Sarbonis. The Idumeans are Nabateans. When driven from their country by sedition, they passed over to the Jews and adopted their customs. The greater part of the country along the coast to Jerusalem is occupied by Lake Sarbonis and by the tract continuous to it. For Jerusalem is near the sea, which, as we have said, may be seen from the arsenal of Joppa. These districts of Jerusalem and Joppa lie towards the north. They are inhabited generally, and each place in particular, by mixed tribes of Egyptians, Arabians, and Phoenicians. Of this description are the inhabitants of Galilee, of the plain of Jericho, and the territories of Philadelphia and Samaria, surnamed Sabas by Herod. But although there is such a mixture of inhabitants, and this is the important part, because up to this point, he is saying that, yes, Galilee and the surrounding areas of Jerusalem are a great mixture of peoples. He names the Egyptians, Phoenicians, Arabians, and if we look in the historical record, the Phoenicians were one of the first people of Ham that interacted in-depthly with the sons of Japheth, the Phoenicians as well as the Hittites. So we see him saying that these people are mixed in, but let's see where he say the original inhabitants or the original stock of Jerusalem comes from, because this is true. At the 1st century AD, you had all types of people in Jerusalem. Like he said, you had Arabians, you even had Germans in Jerusalem in 1st century AD. But let's listen to what he says as who are the original inhabitants or the original stock of the Yahudim. And this is what he says. But although there is such a mixture of inhabitants, the report most credited among many things believed respecting the temple of Jerusalem and the inhabitants is that the Egyptians were the ancestor of the present Jews. And in some small part, he is right. Actually, he's 2/12 right, because we all know that Manasseh and Ephraim they come from an Egyptian priest, and we have Egyptian women, or rather the daughter of an Egyptian priest, and we have Israelites marrying Egyptian women all through the scripture. So it's definitely, a point to realize that when this person is saying that the original stock is of an Egyptian / Ethiopian / Nubian stock, that's speaking directly to the so-called black man. But let's proceed. Now, when we go to Benjamin of Tudela, this is in the 12th century, 1100 AD. And what he says is, he speaks of his journey coming from China, and on his return, he speaks of the Israelites in the Djibouti. And he says they worship the sun, and they have high places everywhere outside the city at a distance about half a mile. And every morning they run forth to greet the sun. For on every high place a solar disk is made of cunning workmanship. And as the sun rises, the disk rotates with thundering noise. And all, both men and women, offer incense to the sun with censers in their hands. Such are the superstitious practices. And throughout the island, including all the towns there, live several thousand Israelites. The inhabitants are all black, and the Yuhadim also. So this is a good point to just interject something that I want to say, because as we go further into this presentation, we'll see a lot of practices and institutions being practiced by Israel that's not of the Most High. Here we see Benjamin Tudela speaking of them worshiping the sun. One thing we need to understand, and one thing people who are duplicitous in their refutations or just might not know, one thing they will say is that the practices that Israelites or so-called people you're saying are Israelites exhibited are pagan practices, therefore they cannot be Israelites. But that is a non sequitur as it pertains to lineage, because a person who says they're Israel, they can be an atheist, they can be Catholic, they can be a Protestant, so being an Israelite isn't based on doctrine, it's based on ethnicity. And that ethnicity can delve off into all type of practices, which I will be showing later on in this presentation. So to my brothers and sisters, when you look at the things that I say, and even things you see on my channel showing the anthropological ties of Israel to West Africa, some of those things I might be showing are not of the Most High, but that does not cancel them out from being Israel. Because once again, lineage does not dictate your religious practices, so to speak. Or, to say rather explicitly, because when I say so to speak, because if you come up in that nation, you would thereby by default come under that. But if you're not under those mandates, you're not tied to those. You are still lineal, and you're still consanguinely tied, meaning by blood, tied to Israel. So let's keep that understood. Now, in the book by Robert Knox, in the 18th century, The Races of Men, he says, in the history of the Jewish, Coptic, the great question of the extinction of race has been considered. These races, placed by theorists with the so-called Caucasian race, and at the head of the Caucasian family, I consider as belonging to the dark races of men. They are African and Asiatic, not European. The purest of the Jewish race is dark and tawny, yellow-colored persons with jet black hair and eyes seemingly colored. There is no mistaking the race. Now, hopefully, from the information that I just provided, and I want to stop this because it seems like two things are clashing. So excuse me. Let me and continue. So, like I was saying, basically the point that was just established by the information that was provided, sourced out material, is that the Israelite and the Yuhadim, the ancient Jews, are actually a black people. And that needs to be understood and explained. And for the people that's here to refute that information. Like I said, I established the pillars as far as extra biblical, because I'm trying to stay out of the biblical scriptures with this presentation, because the scriptures speak to the spirit expressly. So I'm going from a scholarly perspective. The foundation of me saying that the Israelites are a black people have been laid out. So to refute those things, that would have to be the refutation. But let's continue. So now the second point to be established is that the Israelites and the Yuhadim were widely dispersed throughout Africa. And to establish that fact, again, we're going to go to the source material and see what the historical record says. Now, the renowned Aksumite Empire of Ethiopia is a well-known and acknowledged people of Israelite descent. From the Ashkenaz conscious community, the scholars, the whole nine, this is a recognized fact. What is not notable or is revealed is the facts, or rather the facts behind the creation of the Aksumite Empire and its relation to the establishment of dispersed Israelite nation states, starting in Chad and ending to the furthest extremities in West Africa. Now, what I have here are all dates that speak to the Israelite presence in East and Central Africa. And we see here it's starting from the 6th century all the way to the 12th century AD. And when we look at it, we're going to go to Procopius, who's the 6th century AD Byzantine scholar, and his books were basically speaking on the history of the wars of the Byzantine king. And when we look at what he says, he speaks of, at that time, and I'm going to read what he says. At that time, the idea occurred to the Emperor Justinian to ally himself with the Ethiopians and the Homerites in order to injure the Persians. I shall now first explain what part of the earth these nations occupy, and then I shall point out in what manner the emperor hoped that they would be of help to the Romans. The boundaries of Palestine extend toward the east to the sea, which is called the Red Sea. So now we see he's calling Palestine all the way to the Red Sea. Now this sea beginning at India comes to an end at this point in the Roman domain, and there is a city called Elis on its shore, where the sea comes to an end, as I have said, and becomes a very narrow gulf. And as one sails into the sea, from there the Egyptian mountains lie on the right, extending toward the south. On the other side of a country deserted by men extends northward to an indefinite distance, and the land on both sides is visible as one sails in as far as the island called Lotub, not less than 1,000 stades distant from the city of Elis. On this island, Hebrews had lived from old in autonomy. Now, when you search out this area, this is the same area that Benjamin Tudel was speaking of, and that's Djibouti. And I'll continue. But in the reign of this Justinian, they have become subject to the Romans. From there on, there comes a great open sea, and those who sail into this part of it no longer see the land on the right, but they always anchor along the left coast when night comes on. So here we see Procopius in the 6th century speaking of Israelites in the Djibouti, which is present-day Somalia, in that area, the Horn of Africa, a great port city. But let's continue. Here we have Eldad the Danite. And before I go to that, one thing I want to say, besides these brothers and sisters in the conscious community not really giving us the information that their so-called master teachers speak, not even speaking on their lineage, these brothers time and time again discredit great African people. From Marcus Garvey to Oleg Equianu to oral historians that's embedded in Africa, these brothers and sisters continue to discredit these brothers. But let's continue. So we have the brother Eldad Hadani, 9th century person from the tribe of Dan. And the book here takes stock of the long journey that both Eldad and his writings have made through Jewish and Christian imaginations from the moment he stepped foot in North Africa to the turn of the new millennium. Each of his chapters assuage a major leg of this voyage, offering an in-depth look at the original source material and shedding light on the origins and later reception of this elusive character. So again, let's look into this brother from Africa and let's hear what he has to say. And let's not try to infuse or be subjective and try to discredit this brother, like so many scholars of the 19th and 20th century have done when trying to figure out how this brother claims to be an Israelite. But let's continue. A so-called sub-Saharan African people. This is what he says, or this is what we see here is the community from in Alexandria, or rather Cairo, their query to their rabbi. And this is what they say to him. They say, we wish to inform our master that a man by the name of Eldad the Danite from the tribe of Dan visited our community. He told us that 4 tribes, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, are in one place, ancient Evelus, where the gold is. They have a judge by the name of Abudan, and they pass judgment on cases involving the 4 capital punishments. Residing in tents, they travel from place to place and set up camp. They are immersed in battle with the 7 kings of Cush. It takes 7 months to traverse their land, and 5 of those same kings, with whom they are constantly at war, surround them from the backside and 2 flanks. Whoever is faint-hearted is placed at the service of the Most High. Although they possess the Hebrew Bible in its entirety, they read from neither the scroll of Esther deeds, for they were not involved in that same miracle, nor the scroll of Lamentations. Throughout their Talmud, there is no mention of any sage, but rather Yeshua said this in the name of Moses, who said in the name of the Almighty. Every man of strength is put to war, and they do not budge from their posts. Upon in their induction, they do not mobilize in mixed units. So what the researchers see, what the scholars see, what the people with the PhD sees, because all praises to the Most High, a lot of the material that these scholars have, we are now privy to. The information that formulates their footnotes, we are now privy to. Not all, but a majority of them. And what we're looking at here speaks to not only this source, but several other sources as well. I brought up a source speaking of Benjamin Tudela, speaking of Israelites in the Djibouti. He also speaks of Israelites coming from not only East Africa, but he speaks of them being in Ghana. And we all know Ghana eventually came to be the Ghana Empire. So that same source that Benjamin speaks of is independently and not connected to this source, but it speaks to the same information and to the same conclusion that I came to, because it mentions same place names. So I just want that to be understood, because we will be going to that Benjamin Tudela source. But we need to understand the things that he's saying here. One thing, and the most important thing that he is saying, is that they have a form of what a lot of people call temple worship. It's nothing rabbinic or Talmudic about what they do. So when we hear the people make arguments, which I think are silly arguments, but when they make arguments of where is our Talmud, but more, what the thing I call silly is when they also say, why are we not circumcised according to the rabbinic tradition? That's silly to say, but it's also sourced out and documented why we don't have those practices, because Talmud is not of the Torah as it relates to being formed in the days of Joshua. because here we see they refer to Joshua saying that this means that this was the last great prophet that was amongst them. They don't have the scroll of Esther, which shows them being in Babylon, because they were not in Babylon. So we need to understand that the migration from East Africa to West Africa is one that does not involve the rabbinic tradition. We see that more in our, and I repeat that, in our migration in the North African circles, in the Sephardic circles. Those circles have more of a Talmud because those are more stable institutions. But let's continue. The smallest among them would chase many, and each of them shouts the battle cry loud as the roar of the lion. He's speaking of Israelites in Simeon Mountains, the dynasty that stretched so far that he said it's how long? He said it's 7 months to traverse their land. So when you're looking at it, 7 months, that's 30 times 7, that's 210 days. 50 days travel is approximately about 1,200 miles. So just imagine how much of an area that covers. And when you look at the history, we see that a kingdom actually came and created a wedge between that vast land. And that kingdom is the kingdom of Canaan, because it did not expand from east to west. It expanded from north to south. And that what divided that nation. But let's continue. So in the 11th century, we have Severus Ibn Mukafa, and in his A History of the Holy Eastern Church for the Patriarchs of Alexandria, this is a compilation, and it's based on sources starting in the 9th century, or rather 880 specifically, going all the way to the 11th century. So it's a history of the early church of Alexandria. And this is what he says in the 11th century. He says that it was a woman, a queen of Bani el Hamiyah, or rather Himyarites, had revolted against him and against his country, speaking of Abyssinia. She took captive from it many people and burned many cities and destroyed churches and drove him, the king, from place to place. That which befell him was a retribution for what the king who was before him had done to the metropolitan in the days of the father Abulcosmas, as we have explained earlier, through his falsification and fraud. So here we see that this woman, queen of Bani el Hamiyah, or Himyarite, is a woman that we'll see when it's spoken of in the Ethiopian tradition is also called Gudith, because this queen of Bani has a field, and it's called the Field of Gudith, which is an archaeological spot in Ethiopia that shows the destruction that she did in the 11th century. Now, in the book, A New History of Ethiopia, being full and accurate description of the kingdom of Abyssinia, is an unchanged, high-quality reprint of the original edition, written in 1684, says this. And we're going to continue on. And a little before Gihon, which descends from the land of Cush, over which there rules a king, which they call Sutton El Abash, which is the true name of the Neget. Nevertheless, he relates many things. For example, he writes that the Jews did inhabit great mountains and lived according to their own. Now, this comes from, like I said, A New History of Ethiopia. And he is interpreting this from the itinerary of Benjamin Tuldea. And like I said, we're going to go to the exact source, which is Benjamin Tuldea, and see what he says. But just remember, he says that the land of Cush, a Sultan El Abaj, but when we look at the original version, it's actually Abyssinia, and he's correlating and he's interpreting, and when I say he, meaning the writer of the history of Ethiopia, he's interpreting this information just as I am, as to speak of Jews being in these mountains and these places in Africa. So let's continue. So that's a 12th century source. Now let's go to Marco Polo. Marco Polo was a great traveler, one of the first people to speak on China and have a history of China that was given to the Europeans. And around 1300 AD, this is what he says. He says, Abash, i.e. Habasha, i.e. Abyssinia, is a very great province, and you must know that it constitutes the Middle India. Now, the Middle India is basically Kush, the Horn of Africa. That's what these writers call Middle India. And it is on the mainland. There are in it 6 great kings with 6 great kingdoms. And of these 6 kings, there are 3 that are Christians and 3 that are Saracens. But the greatest of all the 6 is a Christian, and all the others are subject to him. There are also Jews, or rather Yuhadim, in the country, and these bear 2 marks, one on either cheek, and the Saracens have but one on the forehead, or rather on the forehead, excuse my ebonics, extending halfway down the nose. So here we see in the 1300s, Marco Polo is speaking of Israelites being in Abyssinia. And when we listen to this information, it's always consistent with all of the sources that we see. And when it's not also being consistent, it's showing that migration pattern. But let's continue on. Now, in the book, a particular description of all the known borders, coasts, and islands of Africa, which John Leo have left undescribed, collected out of many or sundry ancient and late writers, translated by John Pori. So actually, this is a source where they don't actually know who is the exact writer, but they do know that this is not what John Leo Africanus has left them. This is from another ancient writer or another ancient source. And this was documented in the 19th century. Excuse me. Now, it says this: the kingdom of Damut does border upon the kingdom of Zol, and is enclosed on either side with the lake of Barsina and the land of Zanzibar or Zangubar. Howbeit, other place Damut between the kingdoms of Bangu and Gong towards the west, which opinion seems most probable. This country abounds with gold, ginger, grapes, corn, and beasts of all sorts. The slaves of this kingdom are much esteemed and are commonly sold throughout all Arabia, Persia, and Egypt, where they prove most valiant soldiers. You remember how, like I say, it's always consistent with what we're reading. These people are always warriors. The cream of their crop are great fighters. This is a theme that we see through all of this, or rather all of the documents that's speaking to these people. The greater part of the people of Damut are Gentiles, showing that the kingdom of Damut was just not Israelites. There were a mixture of people. So that's to need to be understood as well. And the residue Christians, who have certain monasteries. And this kingdom is that exceeding high and dreadful mountain. Again, here's that mountain that we hear about. The mountain having one narrow passage only to ascend by, where the priest and his nobles, which are convicted of any heinous crime, to suffer ignominious death with hunger and cold. About the fountains of Nile, some say that there are Amazons or women warriors, most valiant and redoubted. Of these Amazons, read more which use bows and arrows and under the govern in the discourse of a person, aphonama patent of a queen. As likewise the people called Cam or following Kafats, being as black as pitch and of a mighty stature, and as some think, descended of the Yuhadim. But now they are idolaters and mostly deadly enemies to the Christians, for they make continual assaults upon the Abyssinians, despoiling them both of life and goods. But all the daytime they lie lurking in the mountains, woods, and deep valleys. So again, this is speaking to that Israelite presence that we're going to see that existed in the Horn of Ethiopia and continue to move westward as the persecution mounted. And we're going to see where that split of Axum and Israel happened. Again, so we have the history of the Holy Church of the Patriarchs of Alexandria. We're going to be looking at the Keper Nagabs. And we're going to be looking at the travels to discover the source of the Nile. Now, this individual here, James Bruce, is an individual who lived among the people of the Nile for 12 years. And in his accounts, he's going to be speaking to what he's been told, what he's observed, and what he's witnessed among the people in the Nile Valley. Now again, while we're all familiar and acquainted with the Ethiopian Yuhadim or Jew, what we are not familiar with is the massive split between the Israelites who accepted Roman Catholicism and the Israelites who did not. It was those who accepted Roman Christianity that were able to, with the assistance of Christendom, repulse and send to flight those of the noble family that resisted conversion while simultaneously establishing their kingdom in Axum, while the family that fled resettled in the mountains and came to be known as the Simeon dynasty, centered in the highlands of Ethiopia, remaining a power up until the 16th century. And it's the fleeing of those Israelites into greater Africa that came to make up a sizable portion of the West African population, and one we shall examine further. And what we see here is an excerpt from that same book, Travel to Discover the Source of the Nile. And in that book, we see it says about the year 960, an attempt was made by this family to mount the throne of Abyssinia, as we shall see hereafter, when the princes of the house of Solomon were nearly extirpated, meaning killed, upon the rock Damo. This, it has probably produced more animosity and bloodshed. At last, the power of the Falasha was so much weakened that they were obliged to leave the country of Denver, having no cavalry to maintain themselves there, and to take possession of the rugged and almost inaccessible rocks in that high ridge called the Mountains of Simeon. One of these, which nature seems to have for a fortress, they chose for their metropolis, and it was ever after called the Jews' Rock. So we see here James Bruce, who resided among the people of Ethiopia, like I said, for 12 years, are relating to us the oral histories of these people of Ethiopia. And like I said, we can find that in the Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, specifically page 485. And in the book, again, The Patriarchs of the Eastern Church of Alexandria, we read on page 171. In his days, the king of Abyssinia sent to the king of Nubia a youth whose name was George, and who made known to him how the Lord had chastised him. he and the inhabitants of his land, it was that a woman, a queen of Bani el Hamiyah, Bani el Damuth. Now remember, we read the source that was speaking of Damad as being filled with Israelites, had revolted against him and against his country. She took captive from it many people and burned many cities and destroyed churches and drove him, the king, from place to place. Now remember, we can actually go and find the archaeological evidence that speaks to this. It's called the Field of Judith, or the Field of Judith. Now, again, in Benjamin of Tudela, in the 12th century, this is what he says. He says, from there it is 12 days to Zebed, where there are a few Jews. From there it is 8 days' journey to Cush, which is on the mainland, called the land of Aden. And this is Eden, which is in Thessalar. The country is mountainous. There are many Israelites there, and they are not under the yoke of the Gentiles, but possess cities and castles on the summits of the mountains, from which they make descents into the plain country called Libya, which is a Christian empire. These are the Libyans of the land of Libya, with whom Jews are at war. The Yuhadim take spoil and booty and retreat to the mountains, and no man can prevail against them. So again, we have the book of the Patriarchs of Alexandria. We just look at Benjamin Tudela speaking from the 12th century, and we see here that this all speaks to the dynasty of Simeon. And again, this is a dynasty that resisted the conversion and ruled from the Simeon Mountains. They were Ethiopian kings, and they were privileged descendants of Zadok. When you read in the Keber Nagas, who was a high priest during the reign of King David and King Solomon. And this Zadok, it was his descendants who came to Ethiopia along with Menelik. And according to the tradition of the Beta Israel community, Zadok's son Azariah was sent with Menelik. But let's continue. Now we have the professor Tadassa Tamrat, who is an Ethiopian historian and scholar of Ethiopian studies. And this is what he says. The country of the Habasha has been ruled by a woman for many years. She has killed the king of the Habasha, who was called Hadani. Until today, she rules with complete independence in her own country and the frontiers of the country of the Hadani and the southern part of the country of the Habasha. So we hear all of these names being repeated. Hadani, Himyarite, Habasha. All of these terms and locations are being repeated. So we, as researchers, using a firm and consistent methodology, we got to include all of those things, or those are the things we include when we make our position and state our evidence to the facts. Now, on page 526 of the book Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, written in the 18th century, it says that independent sovereignty in one family of Jews have always been preserved on the mountain of Simeon, and the royal residence was upon a high pointed rock called the Jews' Rock. Several other inaccessible mountains served as natural fortresses for this people, now grown very considerable by frequent accessions of strength from Palestine and Arabia, where the Yuhadim had been expelled. Gideon and Judith were then king and queen of the Jews, and their daughter Judith, whom in Amharic they called Esther, and sometimes Sait, i.e. fire, was a woman of great beauty and talents for intrigue, had been married to the governor of a small district called Bunga and the neighborhood of Latha, both which countries were likewise much infected with Judaism. So now what I want to look at and take us to is the dispersion that happened because of that.
Suave on the track.
Now, like I spoke earlier, we're not really going to go into the North African dispersion. We're going to kind of stick to this east-west migration, and with that, we're going to kind of start off with the first dispersion we see after that, and that would be the Yabir people. That's in Somalia. Now, here we see the Yabir, or rather the Hebrew people of Somali, and traditionally, the Yabir people claim that their Jewish ancestors arrived in Somalia prior to the formation of the major Somali clans. And as we read, and I'm not going to read all of this because it's rather lengthy, but we're kind of just going to skim over this. And it says here, in 2000, the Sultan of the Yuhadin, Ahmed Yama Herzi, mentioned to a reporter that he didn't know anything about Judaism. He was a practicing Muslim. Even if given the opportunity, few would immigrate to Israel or convert from Islam. This doesn't lessen the scorn that the other Somalis heap on the tribe. Because what we're going to see in the next upcoming slides is that the Yabir people are heavily oppressed in Somalia. Now, the Yabir, also referred to as Yibber or Yahar, are Somali people. They have traditionally been endogamous, meaning that they procreate and they reproduce within their own tribe. They intermarry amongst their own people. And their hereditary occupation has been as magicians, leatherwork, dispensing traditional medicine, and making amulets. The Yabir have a language, a dialect of Somali they keep secret from the ruling Somali clans. Although they are Muslims and ethnically similar to other Somalis, the Yabir caste has been traditionally denigrated, demeaned, and discriminated against by higher social strata of the Somali society. Now, what's interesting and what we want to keep in our mind as we look at the history of Israel in Africa are things that anthropologically tie and connect us together. And we see here, not so much the beginning because this ties earlier than that, but we see here an instance of Israelites who are confirmed, so-called black people, as we see here, that are in modern times that are being tied to a type of sorcery, mystical type of environment. So we need to keep that in mind, that these people, they are but they are practicing witchcraft and things that we see further along in the African culture. Let's continue. Now, during the latter half of the 20th century, it was a big famine that they suffered. And when we read through it, we see here, and I'm going to start in the bold black. It says in Somali, Yabir means Hebrew. So these people are called Yabir, which means Hebrew. So it's known that they are Hebrew people. Now, if the Yabir practiced Judaism in the past, they haven't done so for at least 800 years. Yabir often decline to mention what tribe they are from, as they are ashamed of their low caste status. The Yabir are also well known for their skill in blacksmith and making iron tools and weapons. Historically, the Yabir have practiced a diversity of peddling trades such as folk medicine, spirituality, and magic. As part of their traditional professional practices, they made and sold varieties of herbal medicines, performed traditional surgery involving a circumcision, and specialized in the treatment of bone fractures. Midwife is a popular Yabir specialization. Now, when that last sentence, it kind of reminds me of us in Egypt, how the Hebrew women were midwives. And like I was saying in the previous slide, we see here an instance of them being involved in such things as folk medicine, spirituality, and magic, which is important to note and to keep with us as we go further into West Africa. So again, with the Yabir, we saw one example of a dispersion of the Falasha people, or rather the Beta Yisrael, because that's all Falasha are. They are the Beta Yisrael. Falasha was a pejorative term placed upon them, and we'll see that later. Now, let's look back at some things that the kingdom of DMT, or rather Demut, and the consequences of the dissolution, which is that it created two separate Israelite kingdoms. That was Ascom and Simeon, with Simeon kingdom being slowly attrition until it was totally wiped out in the 16th century. Now, with a population of approximately 500,000 people, where did these people go? I say it's the Falada people that we find in West Africa. So not only will I show the cultural and symptomatic ties of the Falada and Falasha people, I will also show one of the great empires of the Middle Age African, Mali, to be in fact of Israelite origin and extraction. So just a quick recap. We briefly went over the Yabir, Somali. So now we're going to continue westward, and we're going to look at the Falada people, who, like I said, I posit are the dispersed Falasha people of Ethiopia. Now, in the Ethiopian Jewish immigrants in Israel living well and becoming deaf in the homeland by Tanya Swartz, this is what she says on page 32. The Solomon kings, the dynasty which started in 1270 and traced its descent from King Solomon into the ancient Ethiopian kingdoms of Axum, set out to impose hegemony on all the independent people, including the Ayu or Jewish populations of the Ethiopian highlands. The Beta Yisrael, who were geographically dispersed and politically divided at the time, rebelled and resisted conversions. In a response to this external threat, the religious basis of the group was strengthened, and a centralized and relatively unified political organization was established by the 16th century. However, by the early 17th century, they were totally defeated and lost their independence. Emperor Yishak's reign was a significant period in the history of the Beta Israel because it marked the beginning of their dislocation and loss of land rights. The emperor is said to have decreed, "He who is baptized in the Christian religion may inherit the land of his father. Otherwise, let him be Falasi," which is a landless person, a wanderer. A later scribe added the comment, "Since then, the Beta Yisrael, House of Israel, have been called Falaks, or exiles." The Beta Israel responded by either converting to Christianity or migrating to areas of poor quality farmland which were vacant, or by staying on their lands no longer as independent agriculturalists but as tenants to recently arrived colonists. They also began to seek ways to supplement their income from agriculture and turn to crafts such as pottery, weaving, building, and smithing. So what we're going to look at now is just another instance where we see a strong anthropological tie of Israel with the Falada people. And just so it's understood and explained, when I say anthropological, I'm meaning, or rather that means exhibiting the same culture, exhibiting the same practices amongst a people. So let's continue. Now, the Falada people, as we see here, they originally, or rather, quote unquote, originally come from Western Africa, and they resettled in the Blue Nile in the 1950s. So the question then is, why are they resettling in the Blue Nile? because to resettle somewhere means you've been there previously. But I'll continue. The Falada Umburu actually consists of several ethnic groups which have their own local language, religion, and native homeland, originally from Western African countries including Mali, Mauritania, Cameroon, and Nigeria. The Falada live in the forested savanna plains between El Obeid and El Damazin. The reclusive Falada people are a Semitic tribe that migrated from Western Africa to Greater Sudan starting in the 19th century. So these are Semitic people in the 1800s migrated from West Africa to Sudan, the Blue Nile specifically. Now these same people, these Falada, just as the Falasha, are people that are treated as wanderers, operating in varying tribal makeups from peaceful settlers, marauding or encroaching invaders. The Falada people are littered throughout 15th to 19th century historical accounts of them being dotted all along East, Central, and Western Africa. And here we see a Falada merchant and a Falada woman. And these aren't just random images. These are true Falada people. When you investigate the Falada people, you see a Semitic people that the world at large has no concrete knowledge of their origins. Again, these aren't just random photos. These are true-to-life Falada people. In an article from Al Jazeera speaking on the trials and tribulations of the Falada people, Nazarene Geet states this: they are vulnerable, the World Vision Food Security and Development Officer told Al Jazeera, because nobody understands who they are or has investigated their movements. The war in this country affects them and they need help, but they need to be stable so NGOs can build a relationship with them. Amudu Hamte Bey, who brought us the African proverb, when an African elder dies, it's like as if a library has been burned down. He relates his people, who are of the Falada or Fulani people, he compares their lineage, or rather their trials and tribulations, he compares that to the Israelite people. And when he says that, or rather, let me get it.
Suave on the track.
As I'm gonna read right here. Excuse me, Salaki. Insofar as, like Jews before the creation of Israel, they, the Fulani, the Falada, are dispersed in many countries where they give rise to recurrent reproaches from other communities that do not differ much from one country to another. They are often perceived as prone to communitarianism, nepotism, and prompt to betray. Now, one of the most and more intriguing things that I see that ties them to Israel is that they have the same way of life. They have Torah in their constitution. And I'll show that here. Central to the Falada people's lifestyle is a code of behavior known as Pulaka, which are passed on by each generation as high moral values of the Wodabi, which enable them to maintain their identity across boundaries and changes of lifestyle. Essentially viewed as what makes a person Falada, Puluka includes Manya, which is patience, Gatsi Simiti, which is modesty, Hakil, which is wisdom, Sagara, which is courage and hard work. Now, the Fulani, they call it Puluga or Puluka. And that means the Falada pathways, which is very interesting because when we look at the Hebrew terms and the Hebrew words, in particular halakha, that means the exact same thing in its definition, which is the way. So that is a tie and an anthropological instance that shows Israelites practicing the same code of life that these Falada people practice. But let's continue. El-Idrisi in the 12th century, speaking of the Yuhadin in Cameroon. This is the source, and you can find that in his book, which I will bring up later because I come back to it. And what he says is, they were formerly in Cameroon well-known towns and remarkable residences, but the people of Zagwa and Lamotun of the desert, who inhabited both sides of this country, undertook the conquest, annihilated most of these towns, and dispersed or destroyed their tribes. The inhabitants of the country of Cameroon, according to report of the merchants, claimed to be Yuhadin. That's in the 1100s. El-Idrisi. Leo Africanus in the 16th century says this on page 20 of his book, The History and Description of Africa, which you can find on archive.org. Excuse me. Moreover, this part of the world is inhabited, especially of Africa, by 5 principal nations, by the people called Kafri or Kafats, that is to say outlaws, by the Abyssinians, the Egyptians, the Arabians, the Africans, Moors, and continue as we go further, some others Christians, and some Jewish in religion, the greatest part of which people are thought to be descended from Ham, the cursed son of Noah. Now that's Leo Africanus in the 16th century. Now, when we go to a particular description of all the known borders, coasts, and inlands of Africa, this says this: the Abyssinians have no great knowledge of Nile by reason of mountains. And like I brought forward earlier, I just want to show the continuity in the time frame of Israelites in Africa, because this is something I brought out earlier, but this is more speaking of a timeline. He says that, again, one of Israel towards the west, where these are Israelite people. And this is, again, like I said, the book where the places where John Leo did not speak of. These are other ancient writers. And here we go again. Page 163. It speaks of them having the Jewish law before any prophet or teacher, but from Yahweh himself. And actually the last 2 sentences is what I want to go to. It says, neither is there any region in all the Negroes' land which has in it at this day any Christians at all. At the same time, such as were founded to be Jews, Christians, or of the African religion were slain, every man of them. So Leo Africanus is talking about Israelites being slaughtered in Africa in the 1600s. So what we're going to do here is look at further ties of Israelite culture in West Africa and Africa at large. And like I said, anthropology is basically the science of human beings, especially the study of human beings and their ancestors through time and space, and in relation to physical character, environmental and social relations, and culture. In the book, Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, page 487, this is what they say. I asked them, being from Judea, where they got that language which they spoke, whether it was one of the languages of the nations which they had learned on the coast of the Red Sea. They apprehended, but it was mere conjecture, that the language which they spoke of was that of those nations they had found on the Red Sea, after leaving Judea and settling there. And the reason they gave was certainly a pertinent one, that they came into Abyssinia speaking Hebrew with the advantage of having books in that language, but they had now forgot it. And in the book Christian Researching in Asia, it says, I was informed that the black Jews possess formal copies, Old Testament, New Testament, written on goat skins, and that in the synagogue of the black Jews, there was an old record chest into which the decayed copies of their scriptures had been thrown. I accordingly went to the synagogue with a few of the chief men and examined the contents. The manuscripts were of various kinds on parchments, goat skins, and cotton paper. Wait, hold up. Someone needs to tell these brothers and sisters that they need a certain textual tradition. Their book needs to come from the King James Version or the Codex Sinaiticus. They have to follow that textual tradition. They can't have the biblical text written on goat skins. It can't be. Or at least that's what the proponents of the Hamitic hypothesis would say. But let's continue. In A New History of Ethiopia, it states, the only copy of the Old Testament which they have is in Ge'ez, the same made use of by the Abyssinian Christians, who are the only scribes, and sell these copies to the Yuhadim. And it is very singular that no controversy or dispute about the text has ever yet arisen between the professors of the two religions. They have no Keterah or various readings. They never heard of the Talmud, Targum, or Kabbalah, neither have they any fringes or ribbon upon their garments, nor is there, as far as I can learn, one scribe among them. So in the 17th century, we see them speaking of Yuhadim being on a very base level of sustenance, that they are in debt to the Christians, the black Christians, for their scriptures, which have up to this point been destroyed. Now, this is what I was speaking to earlier, and something that we need to understand before we go to this. Now, the ritualistic behavior that we see among the Israelites, that we see in West Africa, is not condoning the practices they have, because as it's stated in Deuteronomy 6, Hear, O Israel, Elohim is one, and that Elohim is not to be put beside no other. So we need to understand that. But as in the time of Manasseh, and as with a lot of the Israelite kings of Judah, they fell off into pagan worship and disobeying the Most High. So we're going to look at that real quick. We're going to look at the practice of scarification in Africa. And until I'm presented with otherwise, I see the earliest reference to scarification in Africa being attributed to Israel, and that will be El Idrisi. And El Idrisi is someone we're going to go to later when speaking of Israel and Africa, because it's important that we understand there's so many things that he says within his information that needs to be isolated and spoke of. And this is one of them, the scarification. He says the residents are scarred in Lamlam, and we're going to see further that he says Lamlam is an Israelite kingdom. And we see here his source is saying as such. And not only him, but we see Marco Polo coming along in the 1200s, or rather the 1300s, if I'm not mistaken, saying that the Yuhadim in Abyssinia marked themselves as well. So, as I stated, according to my methodology, these are, just as with the description of the Yuhadim being so-called sub-Saharan black, this is the earliest attestation to scarification that I have come across. And it speaks to Israel being the people that practice that. So when I hear these African scholars speaking of scarification and, you know, we cannot be Israel because of that, or they try to disassociate Israel because that's something we would never do. No, that's something we were mandated not to do, to scar ourselves for the dead. But just because we were mandated to do those things does not mean we did not practice them once again. So let that be understood. Now, we have the same laws among certain tribes in Africa today concerning marriage. Here we see an excerpt from Mission to Cape Coast, Africa, on page 144, it's talking about a king of Ashanti beheading a woman after she was ordered to drink doom upon being suspected of infidelity. So here this woman was accused of cheating, was made to drink doom, she choked, and she was executed. In another book, A Description of the Coast of North and South Guinea, on one page 22, it speaks of the same thing, but they call it the belly mo. They say when you drink the belly mo, once you're accused of infidelity, and if you call for you choke, you're found guilty. And if you're found guilty, you're punishable with death. That's the exact thing spoken of in Numbers 5:19, the law of jealousy, that the woman is caused to drink a bitter drink. And here we see an actual instance in Africa where we see this law of jealousy being played out. He's questioning him, asking him, did you sleep with this man, woman? He said he's innocent.
Chief Sorrow has passed the problem of deciding the truth to Benge, a scarce and expensive poison with a strychnine base. It is used in the most important and trustworthy of Zande oracles. Representatives are appointed for Bakoyo and Gume to consult the Benge operator who administers the poison to chickens. The operator will ask the chickens whether Bakoyo did in fact sleep with the wife of Gingiti. Whether the chickens live or die will determine the truth. The ritually proper preparations for the use of Benge take some days, so until then the accused, Bakoyo and Gume, are kept together in a prison hut on Sorrow's compound. There they will work for the chief until judgment has been passed.
And this right here is speaking to just a few of the African names that exist today that we find in the Bible. You have names like Akan, Amasa, Anani, Anan. It all speaks to that. And
did you know that there are hundreds of Ghanaian names in the Bible?
Now, I'm not going to play this, but I just want you to know, for the source for these names is found in this video right here. Now, this one I kind of found funny. That's why I labeled it as just a little bit TMI, too much information. But in the book, A Description of the Coast of North and South Guinea, this is what he says. I have shown how much these Africans are subject to superstition, and one shall add no more but this particular, that they will not ease themselves, or rather defecate at sea, unless they be too far from the shore, and when they do it at land, they cover it with earth or fine sand. That speaks to Deuteronomy 23:13, when it tells us to make sure that whenever we ease ourselves, that we shall dig, turn back, and cover that which we laid down, or which, when we do our thing, rather. So again, like I stated, these are anthropological ties that we see to Israel, because every tribe in Africa does not do this. We see circumcision. Leo Africanus says on page 76 of the History and Description of Africa, to the north of Congo, upon the seacoast begins the kingdom of Luango, tributary to, in times past, to the king of Congo. It abounds with elephants, and the inhabitants, called Brahmas, are circumcised after the Jewish manner. So again, this is Leo Africanus speaking of this. Now we're going to go into the part where it's going to get real interesting, and we see real strong paganism and idolatry amongst Israel. And it's sad to say, but it's a reason why we are in West Africa and not in Northeast Africa, which is Israel. It's a reason for that. So let's just keep that in mind. In the book by Idrisi, he says, as for the city of Tuster, Deuster of Chooster, it is, as we have already said, built on an eminence. At its gates, the water rises by means of a lock to Fak, Duke. It is said that the prophet Daniel was buried in the Tusta River. Ibn Hukul reports that it was Abu Musa el-Akabri who found the coffin of this prophet. The Jews worshipped him in their synagogues and regarded him as a talisman by means of which they hoped in times of drought to obtain rain. And that's on page 582 of A History of Africa by Idrisi. And here we see the many different designations for amulets, talismans. We see Grigri amulets, and we see the word that's been designated to Africa, basically, and that's fetish. We see a lot of scholars use that word fetish, and that's what we see predominantly in the verbiage of African so-called spiritual magic. And we see here that these are all, or rather, the instances that we see Israel delving into these type of things. As we seen with the Yabir earlier, it said they have a practice of folk medicine, spirituality, and magic. And we see in the book a description of the coast of North and South Guinea. I must further add, in relation to the Grigris of the blacks, that they may perhaps been originally made in imitation of the ancient practice of the Yuhadim of wearing phylacteries, that is, rolls or flips of parchment with some sentences of scripture written on them according to what Yah had commanded. And one thing we need to understand about these fetishes, whether they are objects, they can be words. It's just an embedment of power that's placed into something. And here we see all the admonishments that the prophets of Israel spoke against delving into these things, such as sorcery and spiritualists. In that day, in Micah 5, it says, declares Yahweh, I will destroy your horses from among you and demolish your chariots. I will destroy the cities of your land and tear down all your strongholds. I will destroy your witchcraft, and you will no longer cast spells. So we see here that casting spells were a part of the paganism that Israel displayed. Now, in an article by Lucider Hearn in 1886, it says, the fear of what are styled voodoo charms is much more widely spread in Louisiana than anyone who had conversed only with educated residents might suppose. And the most familiar superstition of this class is the belief in what I call pillow magic, which is the supposed art of causing wasting, sickness, or even death by putting certain objects into the pillow of the bed into which the hated person sleeps. Feather pillows are supposed to be particularly well adapted to this kind of witchcraft. It is believed that by secret spells of voodoo can cause some monstrous kind of bird or nondescript animal to shape itself into being out of the pillow feathers. So here we see them speaking of pillow magic, where you basically make a curse and place it in a pillow for your intended target. Now let's go to the scriptures and see what it says, interestingly, about a pillow. Excuse me. Let's go. And I think I'm just going to have to wait for it to come. And I want to show, because the scriptures that I'm going to show, or the scriptures that we have in Isaiah, I think that's going to be 53, it speaks of the Israelites actually practicing pillow magic. The prophets are speaking to them and admonishing them to stop. And that's why I have that pillow in the Strong's Concordance, because it speaks to that. But it's in my presentation, and for some reason I probably will have to wait about 3 minutes for that. But like I say, it's in my video with those scriptures and verses. I thought it would just flow to it, but Salaki. Now we see here in Ezekiel 21:21, it says, "For the king of Babylon stood at the parting of the way, at the head of the two ways, to use divination. He made his arrows bright, and he consulted with images. He looked in the liver." Now this is what we're about to see right here in Africa.
Now that the people and the cattle are together, it's important to try and get some idea of the future. Some Morsi, like Biobume, have special skill in reading entrails.
So what they try to do with the Hamitic hypothesis is disconnect us from quote-unquote Near Eastern culture. And they try to make African culture look independent of that, which is not the case, as we can clearly see here. The Bible is an ancient text, and it's speaking of the same practices practiced by the same people in that area that's being practiced by West Africans today. Now, there is a tradition in West Africa of several tribes claiming origin from Northeast Africa. It's actually more than that. Now, amongst the Yoruba people, as well as the Igbo, they have as their oral tradition of them coming from Northeast Africa. For centuries in Africa, Asia, and Europe as well, rumors and tales of where the 10 lost tribes of Israel are was the question of ancient scholars from Tertullian to contemporaries now, such as Dirk Lang. They have records speaking of the king of Ghana holding court, flanked by 10 horses with golden saddles, along with 10 young men adorned in gold as well. Possibly could be an allusion to those same lost tribes. El Bakri on page 229 of Mission to Cape Coast, Africa, Thomas Bodis states about kings ruling over 12 tribes, Torah amongst certain tribes as well. And like I said, he says this: one curious evidence, however, may be added of the former identity of the Ashanti, Warsaw, Fanti, Akim, Asin, Akumbo, and part of the Ahanta nations, which is a tradition that the whole of these people were originally comprehended in 12 tribes. Travel to the inland parts of Africa, page 32 speaks of these Africans as worshiping the Lord of Heaven, which religion was not given them by any prophet, but were inspired with it by God himself. The Jewish law prevailed among them afterwards for many years. In the Tariq el-Fatash, it speaks of a community called the Bani Israel in the 15th century having 300 wells and 7 leaders with an army of 1,500 men. So it's communities like these that when we say Israel was in Africa, this is the information we go into. And he's speaking of the Timbuktu region of Mali. And this is going to be in the 15th century, after the dispersion or the splitting of Israel in Axum, which ruled an area 7 months journey. Well, let's continue. And to get more in depth to manuscript C, we see this is what it says. And it's speaking of the sons of Israel having wells and also having conflict with the people in that area and destroying their wells as well. And this is in manuscript C of the Tariq el-Fatash, a 15th century manuscript speaking of the dynasty of Songhai. Now, these names that are flashing are people that we're going to get a little bit more in depth with before we close out. Now, Ghana, or rather the kingdom of Ouagadougou, situated as it were between the southern Saharan desert and the grasslands north of West Africa, Ouagadougou, located on major routes of the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, traded in gold, ivory, salt, cola, and cloth. Control of these routes were crucial to its expansion and success. Now, when we read the itinerary of Benjamin Tudela on page 97, he says, from Aswan, it is a distance of 12 days to Helon, where there are about 300 Jews. There, people travel in caravans a journey of 50 days through the desert called Sahara to the land of Zawila, which is Havila in the land of Ghana. In this desert, there are mountains of sand, and when the wind rises, it covers caravans with the sand, and many die from suffocation. Those that escape bring back with them copper, wheat, fruit, all manners of lentils and salt. And from there they bring gold and all kinds of jewels. This is in the land of Cush, which is on the western confines. From Helon, it is 13 days' journey to Cush, which is Cush, and this is the commencement of the land of Egypt. At Cush, there are 300 Jews. So this Cush, which is the land of Ghana, which is the land of Havila, which is the land of Zavala, is spoken of by Benjamin of Tudela to have 300 Jews. The Akan people have a people within them called the Sefwi Wiyasu. And when we look at the Sefwi Wiyasu people, there was a Ghanaian of them named Aaron Tokofa, and he had a vision where he said he seen spirits and spoke with them that drove him to believe that he and his fellow people were indeed the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Now, he saw a clear connection. So this didn't come from anything. He saw a clear connection and many similarities between his people practices and those of Judaism. For example, it was a tradition in Sefwi for Saturday to be a day of rest. Such a strong tradition that the Sefwi didn't adhere to it were frequently punished. Sefwi also followed the dietary law. Members of the male community were circumcised. And at first he was viewed as crazy, but over time his vision became more and more accepted. Because like I said, they have the same practices, and those practices led him to believe that they were of the lost tribe. Now, when it comes to their chief Kofi Nakua, he states that they came from Israel through Nile, Ghana, and Mali. And when we look at Gideon, this is his description: leader, prophet, and this is basically where I get into Gideon and Ouagadougou actually being Hebrew words. But, you know, we'll just look at this and we'll continue. And this is the area that we find in the 12th to 15th centuries. This is the area where they're speaking of the Israelites being. Now we have amongst the Limba an oral scholar, Mushabi Mutinde, who speaks of them coming from Limba in the 6th century, or rather coming from Mesopotamia. Excuse me. And as we all know, Tudor Parfit, he speaks of the Limba, and he speaks of them in the archaeological sense of having stone structures coming from the town of Syena that corresponds to Da Sayun in Yemen. And Sayun in Arabic means Zion. And as we can see, it's located South Yemen. It's an abandoned city. And this is the place that was deserted by the inhabitants leaving to Africa. That same place that carries the same tribal names as those by the Limba. So when you go to Limba and you see tribal names, they're the same that you will find in this area to this day, according to Tudor Parfit. Now the Dan tribe, looking at the Dan tribe, we find them on the Cote d'Ivoire. Dan tribe's very interesting. You can find them in the Ivory Coast in Liberia. They speak a language called Yakuba. They practice Shabbat. And these are true to life Dan people that we're looking at. Now, some of the things that ties the Dan people to the Israelite nation is the first thing, the obvious thing, their name, the tribe of Dan, their language, which is called Yakuba. They observe the Shabbat. They believe in Deuteronomy 6:4. They have the same laid out instructions of their priesthood as the Levites. So again, these are just some of the things that tie the tribe of Dan, according to Dr. Yai Dion Robert, to the Israelite nation. And with this, we're going to be wrapping it up, looking at the kingdom of Mali. And this is just a brief overview of the kingdom of Mali. Now, when we read Travels to the Inland Parts of Africa, we see him speaking of Lam. And it says their inhabitants as people of those parts relate are Jews, and are indeed most of them unbelieving and ignorant. When any of the inhabitants of the kingdom of Lam comes to have use of his reason, he is burnt in the face in temples. This they do for a token amongst themselves. So this is where he speaks of Lam, and we're going to see where Lam exactly is. Now, in the Geography of Idrisi, written in the 12th century, he says there are only 2 towns in the whole Lam which are not larger than towns. One of them is called Meli or Mali, and the other Dao. They are away one by 4 days. According to reports, the inhabitants are Jewish, and for the most part immersed in ignorance and piety. And from Mission to Cape Coast to Ashanti, we're going to see him pinpointed even further to Mali. From Timbuktu to Hausa is 20 journeys. The 3 first through a wooded country and over the branch of the Niger to Azibi, the frontier town. Hausa was said to be the largest city north or south of the Kula. The Moorish influence to have been established there beyond memory. And the king's name Seriki. Kabi is not the name of the kingdom, but of a large dependent town and district on the Niger. Malawa or Marawa, as the Negroes pronounce it, for they seem invariably to substitute the R for the L of the Moors, is the next extensive in its limits to Borno. It is no doubt the kingdom of Mali, misplaced by Leo and reported to Kadamosta. So here we see that kingdom, which was called Malel by Idrisi, is actually Mali. And with that, I want to end it. You know, I can go on and on with the info. I just want to thank my brother Moore, brother Sal, thank the audience. And with that, we just going to end it. And I say Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, brother Moore. Thank you.
You are most welcome, brother man. Do you want to shut it down here? Do you want to see if people got some questions, etc.? Or
no, I got time.
That's what's up.
I mean, it's definitely up to you.
No, it's up to you, bro. You the guest.
No, I got time. I definitely got time.
So the link is pinned in the chat if you want to jump on, fam. While we're waiting for people to jump on, so there was something I thought very interesting about the groups you were talking about, and it all had to do with like this east to west migration from like the Ethiopia, Djibouti, Yemen, like Somalia area type stuff, like going either through the Central African route or even when we talk about the Limba, right? The Limba talk about they came from like the Yemen area as well, right?
Right.
So there's this east to west migration popping off that way, going through like Central Africa. Then we're seeing this whole like we're talking about like Mali, Nigeria, et cetera, whatnot. What are your thoughts about that migration, in terms of going through Central Africa, et cetera, from East Africa, Southern Arabia to West Africa?
The thing that I see is that when we're looking at Africa or the kingdom of Israel that was in those areas, we can't confine ourselves with the partition that was given us by the world today, meaning that land consisted of not only the Horn of Africa, but also what we know as Yemen. And when we look at the passage of time in history and we're reading sources about this area, we can see that it was a diffusion first with the Axumite kingdom, and it's splitting up the Israelite connection on the mainland of Africa to the Hamitic kingdom, causing that division. It also pushed the Israelites on the mainland further west. And when we read, it speaks of that kingdom being 7 months long to traverse. And we see that also being divided further by the kingdom of Canaan, which I said was a north-south expansion and not an east-west, which would, almost like when you look at a level, how the bubble split, it split that kingdom up and further push the Falasha from not only the home base in Ethiopia, but the home base established by the rebelling Israelites to Axum. So that's what I see with that migration.
All right, real quick, we have an atheist brother of mine coming to the panel named Why So Religious. Real quick, Why So Religious?
I'm not an atheist Quranist anymore. I thought
hold on.
Was on the last stream.
Atheist Cross. I forgot about that one. So real quick, Why So Religious? There is no cussing or no name calling and no threats of any kind on this particular platform and whatnot. So I'm dual streaming on 2 different platforms.
I didn't know that I do that. Have I done that on your stream before? If I have, I'm sorry.
Cuss? Oh yeah, I've heard you cuss before. That's why.
I've cussed, but I've also apologized when I've done it. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. My bad.
On this platform, there is no cussing of any kind. I'm dual streaming on 2 different platforms.
No, I try not to, but sometimes it slips out. Just I apologize when I do it though, and I'll try to refrain from that action.
Yes, sir. So real quick, do you have any questions concerning the presentation?
The presentation. Honestly, I enjoyed the music so much. I was just freestyling over it. I'm not trying to be rude, but I love the music, and the presentation itself was a good one. Like I'm not going to deny that. Like speaking about how now I don't agree with it on certain aspects, such as relating various scriptures to certain parts of Africa, but also I don't have a dog in the fight because I'm an atheist. You know what I'm saying? Like, so if you want to move on from that, that's fine. But it's a good presentation. It's just as an atheist, it doesn't apply to any concepts that I have to bring.
Okay, so are you basically saying you got nothing to add to the conversation?
Well, I mean,
how are you with history?
Wait. I was honestly gonna wait and see if you were willing to talk about when I went live earlier and you came on and you posted a comment, and I don't know if you understood the point of the live stream. No, that's fine. I'll wait.
So you waited 2 hours to be narcissistic. Basically.
No, he waited 2 hours. No. He wanted to talk about something else. Like so again, Gideon, I'm dual streaming on Tuesday. This is going live on Talk for you. So this is somebody who I talked to on other topics concerning like Speaker's Corner and some other stuff. There was an incident earlier today to where a woman got stabbed at Speaker's Corner and whatnot. So my atheist Quranist brother did a stream talking about that. So we were having a little dialogue on that earlier. But yeah, brother man, we will discuss it on a whole different stream. But yeah, I'll definitely touch on that because
10-4. I wasn't trying to intrude or anything. You know what I'm saying?
No worries.
Oh no, it's all good, my brother.
So what I'm gonna do, watch the religious, is I'm gonna put you in the back, and then I'm gonna let other people come on if they want to jump on, and we can build on that one. Like I'll definitely be doing a video on that either tonight or tomorrow morning. So you'll see it. You'll definitely see it because I'm definitely gonna touch on that. But,
I'll mute up, buddy. Y'all go ahead and talk.
All right, man.
Shalom.
Yes, sir. So yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people in the chat saying they dug the presentation. I did as well. I thought it was very entertaining. I thought it was a lot of good information. I think for a lot of people, if you've never delved into the topic, I think it's definitely a good, good first glance and good first a good first primer, like a primer on the whole thing.
Right, definitely.
Let you know what directions to go in and all kind of stuff. I'm sure everybody learned at least one name that they haven't seen before in that presentation, which I think would be a beneficial thing to everybody.
All praises, all praises. Well, it's just in line with, with the truth of the matter. Whether you're an atheist, Christian, Muslim, Israelite, I mean, the historical record is the historical record. And like I said, I appreciate you, my brother. I appreciate Sal for, providing this platform. But, like I say, man, I could go on and on, man. I just found a good landing spot and I just landed. But definitely the presentation is a little more in depth on the channel. It's a little bit more. It's actually not longer, but it has the whole presentation. So it's a little bit more concentrated in the fact that I wasn't freestyling.
So if you want that full presentation from, I do have that link down below and a link to his channel for Israelite Cushite TV. So definitely go check that out, family. So is there anything you want to say before we close out?
No, once again, I just want to give all praises to the Most High in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. Appreciate you more. Appreciate Brother Sal, the people at Debate Talk for You, the listening audience. And I appreciate you, brothers and sisters, for y'all patience. And again, all praises to the Most High. And thanks more. Appreciate it.
Yeah, much appreciation to you, brother man, for coming through and giving that presentation and the time that you took to put the presentation together and all that information, etc. Hope to be speaking to you much more in the future, etc. And other people from the War Machine and other groups, etc.
No doubt.
So with that, family, we appreciate you for tuning in, and we say peace and love.
Shalom.